Thanks, Doug, and good afternoon, everybody. Like Doug said, my name is BJ Bowie. I am with the Michigan State Climate Office and the Great Lakes Integrated Science and Assessments here at Michigan State University. So we're live from East Lansing, Michigan, and today we're going to be going over the recent conditions for February and discuss the outlooks for the next couple of months for the central region. So to get started, just some general information. These webinars are a collaborative activity between the state climatologists and the American Association of State Climatologists, several NOAA agencies, the USDA climate hubs, the Midwestern and High Plains Regional Climate Centers, and also the National Drought Mitigation Center. Next month, if you want to put this on your calendar, the next webinar will be on April 16th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time or 1 p.m. Central, and the presenter will be Pete Goulet from the Minnesota State Climate Office. If you want to see the future climate webinars and information, that can be found at that link there on the screen, and also recordings of the past webinars can be found at those links below. And like Doug said at the beginning, we will be open for questions at the end on anything we're presenting here today or any information that are questions that you have. So to get started, the first part of the webinar that I'll be covering is going to look at the recent conditions across the region and then talk about some of the broader scale impacts that we've seen in the last month from the weather and kind of the ongoing background climate patterns. And then Jeff will take over and give the outlooks for the next couple of months there at the end. So on the right there, just a little picture that was sent to us by Mary Knapp at the Kansas State Climate Office from the Kansas State Highway Patrol of a grass fire near Eudora, Kansas. And that is one of the ongoing concerns in the Plain States, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. So to get started, we're going to take a little look back at the recent conditions that we've seen across the central region. Just starting with where February fell in terms of temperature ranking. Across much of the region, it was above average for the month of February. This is out of 126 years of record. The eastern part of the region was somewhat warmer than the west, but most of them are bouncing between their 90th to 100th warmest February, a little bit less so as you move west in the southern parts of our region, and extreme western parts of our region were near average, so not quite as above normal, but February was milder and a little bit above average. To put that in scope of the winter, so the winter months of December, January, and February across the region, we kind of had a split in the region with most of the eastern part of the central region being much above average. So say Ohio had their 121 warmest winter on, or 121 indicates that it was the fourth warmest winter on record there. So if it was 125, that would be the record warmest. So number scale is a little backwards, but the take home point there is that the statewide average temperatures for the winter season were much above average in the eastern part of the region. And as we moved west, they were somewhat less warm, but still above the long-term mean and long-term average. Moving into precipitation, which is going to take a lot of the center stage today on our webinar, given the record wet year we had across a lot of the region in 2019, except for Colorado and some of the western portions. February, we saw conditions dry out a little bit in the north central part of the region, with North Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa being much below average precipitation. Wisconsin, Michigan, and Nebraska were below average. Smattering of states, Indiana, Colorado, South Dakota, Montana were near average. And then the southern portion of our region and Wyoming were above average. Just to put this in perspective, February is generally a dry season in most of these states, so these total accumulations are relatively small portion of the annual total in most locations. But it is worth noting that we did see some drying, which is a break from the longer term pattern that we've seen across much of our region. Just to put winter in perspective, across much of the region, winter precipitation was above average. And in the eastern states, Michigan and Indiana and Kentucky of our region, they were much above average. So overall, winter kind of continued the overall trend of being wetter than normal, with February seeing some drying in the northern central part of our region. Just breaking this down to the last 30 days, since those numbers were respective at the end of February, now we're in the middle of March. So just kind of put this into perspective of where things have gone in terms of precipitation. Things have been a bit drier across the region. Notice that across Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, the Dakotas, western Minnesota, we've seen most of those areas have seen less than an inch of precipitation, some less than a tenth of an inch in the last 30 days. As you move eastward in the region to the south, there have been some storms that have tracked across southern tier of the region, Kansas, Missouri, southern Illinois, Indiana, into Kentucky, where we have seen quite substantial rainfall, with some areas of Kentucky seeing over 8 inches of precipitation in the last 30 days, which is significant. Those areas do usually see more precipitation this time of year than the more northern regions, but those rainfall events were pretty substantial. In terms of percent of normal, get into what I mentioned about this being the dry season, we'll see that it's kind of, again, a tale of two regions. There's some scattered areas in Montana, the mountainous areas in Wyoming, western South Dakota around the Black Hills there, where we have seen little patches where precipitation was between 150 and 200% of normal for the last 30 days. And then as you move east across the plains and the zoo, the eastern Dakotas, western Minnesota, that's where we have seen conditions be somewhat drier than they have been recently and relative to normal. So that has some impacts that we'll talk about later. And as mentioned on the previous slide, across Kansas, Missouri, into Kentucky, you have that track there where you see precipitation events over a pretty broad region of 120, 200%, and even one station in western Kansas at over 300% of normal precipitation for the last 30 days. So there has been some wetness out there despite the somewhat drier conditions over the broader region. And what does this mean in the longer term? So this is what we're seeing right now. These maps show the estimated soil moisture. When I say estimated, they're a modeled product based off of a whole bunch of different observations and computer models. But it gives us an idea of how much water is out there on the landscape. And these are two different maps. The one in the upper left corner of your screen is the soil moisture anomaly in terms of millimeters across the region. And what we see is that given the very wet year that much of the region experienced in 2019, and even earlier in the winter, there's a lot of water out there on the landscape. If you note eastern Montana, western Dakotas, and down through Nebraska into Kansas, you're looking at 75 millimeters of water to over 125 millimeters of water in the top 1 meter of that soil profile. Some areas that buck the regional trend, if you note in Colorado, there is substantial deficit in the soil moisture in that top meter. So they've experienced some dry conditions, and that's manifested into drought. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit in terms of the drought monitor and what some of the impacts you might see from that. If you also note in over central northern Indiana, western Ohio, there is a little bit of a negative anomaly there. Since this is a modeled product, an ensemble of several models, that is one thing that we think there might be more water on the landscape than what those models are showing. But the take-home point of this is that calculated the soil moisture percentages in terms of percentiles, which that map on the bottom right shows. Much of the northern part of the region is above the 90th and 95th and even 99th percentile in terms of soil moisture on the landscape. We do see a little bit of drying there in central Ohio, a little bit more in Iowa, and then you'll note, as mentioned before, in Colorado and western Kansas, there are some more normal and drier than normal soil conditions out there. So take-home point is there's a lot of soil moisture across much of the region, with some areas in the southwest part of the region experiencing drier. And this is really an impact of that record wet year that much of the region experienced in 2019. In terms of stream flow, so moving from soil moisture to how much water is moving through the spring streams as we come into the spring season, a lot of the concerns we get are about flooding and the impacts associated with that. So across a lot of the northern region here in the Dakotas, Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, northern Michigan, and down through Nebraska and eastern Kansas into Missouri, streams are still flowing at very high rates. There's a lot of water moving through the system. As you move east into the Corn Belt, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, there's a lot of talk about a lot of soil moisture, a lot of wet conditions, but the streams there are have backed down into the normal range. Kentucky is still flowing much above normal. And actually an interesting point that Dennis pointed out earlier is that in Michigan, the southern part of the state where we're at here, you see there's some dots there showing below normal stream flows. And that is actually correct. It's that geologically, those parts of the state are flashier in their stream flows. So we haven't had as much precipitation in the last 30 days here. So some of those streams have backed off from near bankful and are flowing a little bit below normal for this time of year. So that's an interesting thing with the stream flow going on throughout the region. And really to tie this all together, just in terms of put the last month, last season, last year in perspective of the long-term trend for the central region, is that over time, this graph is showing from late 1800s through present, what the annual precipitation is. And what we are seeing is that the region has been getting gradually wetter with time. Specifically, the last 10, 15 years have shown a pretty sharp increase in precipitation over the central region. So those are part of the reason we're seeing a lot of the impacts is that there's just more water on the landscape as we move through time. To bring this into, we just talked about how much water there is on the landscape, what precipitation's been doing. So it might seem a little odd to talk about drought, but there are parts of our region that are experiencing drought conditions, and we'll talk about that here. So what we're seeing is over Colorado, the western part of the state, and then the southern part of the state, and then kind of blowing back up into the eastern parts of the state, bleeding into western Kansas and southwestern Nebraska. We do see areas of abnormally dry conditions, a lot of moderate drought conditions, and then a few patches of severe drought in extreme southern Colorado and southwestern Kansas. Additionally, Montana in the western part of the state does have some areas that are showing abnormally dry conditions. These have kind of been ongoing for the last year in a lot of these regions where there are showing droughts. One thing you will notice is over much of the map, there is currently no drought status being reported. So given the amount of water in the landscape and much of the region, that is not surprising. How this has changed over the last month, if you tuned into the webinar last month, they showed the same map. In the last month, a lot of the drought region you'll see there has not changed in terms of drought classification with the U.S. Drought Monitor. That's shown on gray. The patches of yellow have seen a 1-class drop in degradation in drought status. So that would be worsening drought in those locations. And then some of the border regions there where it's shown in light green showed a 1-class improvement. So where we are seeing drought in the southwest corner of the region, it's been holding steady in most cases. And the northwest part of the region of Montana has worsened a little bit in the last 4 weeks. Since we are wrapping up our winter season and moving into spring, it's important to look at what the amount of snow and the current snow water equivalent to how much water is holding in the snow in the regions where there is still substantial snowpack. So on your screen there, you'll see 2 maps. On the west, that shows the western part of the region and river basin snow water equivalent percent of normal, where normal would be 100 on that graphic. And we see that snowpack in much of the region is near normal to slightly above normal, western Montana through Wyoming down into Colorado. There are a few, there's one little patch in the middle of Wyoming where it is somewhat below normal, but overall, snowpack is running near the historical mean in the mountain areas that impact our region. On the right there, this image is a little dated, but it is the most current one available, shows the simulated snow water equivalent for the area covered by the North Central River Forecast Center. So you see eastern North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and then down into Illinois, Iowa, and parts of Missouri. A lot of this snow actually in the last week has melted. So what was there in the snowpack has moved out of the snowpack onto the landscape and probably into the streams. But what we saw a week ago when this map was made is that the northern stretch of the region, northern Michigan, northern Wisconsin, the Arrowhead in Minnesota, and then eastern North Dakota had above average snowpacks for this time of year, and that gradient as we move south. And then once it decreases in terms of percent of normal, and as we move down into Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, and much of southern Michigan, we have lost our snowpack for the year, so there's currently not much snow cover on the ground. in those regions. In terms of the winter snowfall total, so how much snow has our region got in this winter, and how does it compare to the average for the historical record? This only shows the area covered by the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, so apologies to the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana in our region. These do not cover it, but for the Midwest, what we see is that the upper Midwest, northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and then moving into Michigan, specifically the lake effect zones, you can see that pointed out east of Lake Michigan and then down into Ohio, south of Lake Erie, have seen the most snowfall in the region. That's not surprising, as these are typically our highest areas. Less snowfall occurred as we moved south in the region, with portions of southern Missouri and extreme southern Illinois seeing less than 1 inch of snow this winter. And in terms of how that falls into normal, the northwest part of this region showed snowpacks or snowfalls about 150 to 175% of normal. That was kind of the high. And then as we moved down into the southeast part of the region, we saw less than normal snowfall for the past winter season. So that's kind of the broad overview from the meteorological and climatological perspective, just looking at the variables of what we see and what we observe to look at contextualize how the past season, how the last month has taken shape. So this part of the webinar, we're going to be moving into impacts. So really the tale here is that we've had a drier start to the year than the past year and to the previous months prior to the start of 2020, but the impacts we're seeing are still from a lot of this residual water on the landscape from 2019 and 2018 across the region. In terms of winter severity, this is a neat little product that shows the accumulated weather season severity index, or ASSI. And what this is a accumulated index that takes account of the daily accumulation of snowfall, snow depth, and minimum and maximum temperatures observed at each location, and then puts it into context with the historical record at each of these locations. What we saw as far as the winter of 2019-2020 is that we kind of had a tale of two regions, noting across southern Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, into Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and southern Michigan. We had a really mild winter. Not a lot of long-lived cold temperatures, not a lot of snowfall in these regions relative to what's historically experienced there. But as you move up into the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, northern Michigan, and then westward into Wyoming and eastern Montana, you saw more normal to even severe and extreme winter severity. And most of this was tracked with snowfall this year. So these locations showing extreme winter severity mostly is attributable to the amount of snow they received. In terms of impacts, how this winter season was perceived, take northern Michigan. Marquette there had an extreme winter. They've still got several feet of snowpack on the ground. And that was a big boon for the recreation industry up there. Snowmobiling is a big industry. And so they've had a really positive experience with this extreme winter. Some impacts that were sent to us by our friends in Wyoming, however, if you notice those two purple dots in the middle of Wyoming, they had pretty significant transportation impacts and road closures, because that tracks right along the Interstate 80 corridor, which moves a lot of freight and cargo through the region. And they had to close that highway, so had some negative impacts for the economy there. So that's kind of an interesting way to contextualize what we saw over the region this past winter. Moving into the Great Lakes, in terms of ice cover and temperature, we had a very low year for Great Lakes ice cover. The current Great Lakes total ice cover is, this map was made on March 15th, showing at a 6% ice cover. It's dropped even more the last few days, is down to, I believe, under 5%. Total water area has ice cover, and that residual ice is mostly in the bay areas and more sheltered areas of Straits of Mackinac, Green Bay, Thunder Bay, Whitefish Bay. Otherwise, it's pretty much open water, and we are seeing warmer water temperatures this time of year as a result. So next thing with that is that the Great Lakes are also near or at their record highs on 3 of the 4 main hydrological units of Great Lakes. So If we look at what has happened in terms of Great Lakes water levels, they've been high for the past 2 years, and they're staying high. So it's really a continuation of the recent past that we've been seeing. Currently, Lake Superior is near its record high for this time of year, and then Lake Erie and then Lakes Michigan and Huron are, I believe, above their records for this time of year. Lake Ontario is somewhat lower than the historical highs that they saw last year in some of these, but the water levels overall are still very high on all 5 of the Great Lakes. And we are seeing a lot of impacts from there in terms of shoreline erosion, impacting houses along the lakeshore there, roads. And really, anytime we get winds that push across the lakes in any length, it can really kick up that wave action and then get some flooding in shoreline areas. So that is one impact from the past couple of years that we keep seeing, and it's ongoing and is forecasted to stay about the same for the foreseeable future. With all this water on the landscape that we've been talking about and moving into the spring, it is flooding season. So from the rivers, the runoff, and potential flooding across the central region, some of the impacts we have seen in terms of the upper Missouri Basin. So think north of Sioux City, Iowa, through the Dakotas into Montana, North Dakota there, into Wyoming. Runoff was over 2 times the average for the month of February in terms of water moving into the system. As we mentioned on the previous slide, the Great Lakes are above, at, or in the case of Ontario, near record highs for this time of year. One pretty substantial impact, and it's shown on that map to the right there, is the James River in North Dakota and South Dakota, kind of that area that you see outlined in purple there, has been flooding. At the time, I believe this statistic was given at the end of February, and it's still ongoing. So has not dropped below flood stage over the winter, and it's been above flood stage for basically a year and counting. So they're seeing some pretty significant impacts there. And what this results from in this region.
Yeah,
go
BJ,
ahead.
Just to
Yes.
clarify, that purple region in North and South Dakota is 2 different river systems. One is the James River flowing south,
Yes.
and the Red River up the north flowing north.
Correct. There are 2 river basins there, and they're flowing different directions, and both have pretty potential for major flooding in the upcoming months in both of those river basins. So thanks, Doug, for pointing that out. Moving on from there, just to talk about agricultural conditions, not a lot going on yet, but we are getting reports of planting and field operations in some more southern regions starting to take shape. That's still probably a ways off in some more northern parts of the region. But an interesting fact is that in North Dakota, currently the 2019 harvest is continuing in the northern plains. So that's more North Dakota into Minnesota there. They had very wet fall conditions and were unable to get the corn harvested and sunflowers harvested. So as of February 29th, to the end of February, the harvest in North Dakota was continuing and had reached 61% of acres planted for corn being harvested and 79% for sunflowers. These numbers are a little bit old. They're a couple weeks old, as you see from the date there. So both these harvests, there's evidence that this is progressing. So probably closer to 2/3, maybe 70% for corn and a bit more for sunflowers. But that is a pretty spectacular thing. Corn harvest is still going on this time of year in the northern plains. Moving into other parts of the region, as temperatures have been a little bit warmer than normal, and as we're progressing into spring, there is greening up of winter wheat, pasture land, trees, and horticultural plants across the southern and eastern portions of the region. In areas that had an extremely wet 2019 planting season and growing season and harvest, there is some optimism for spring planting with the warmer than normal temperatures and lower precipitation in a lot of these regions. There has been a slight drying of soils being facilitated. Not a lot goes on in February typically, so it's somewhat improving, but still a long ways to go in some of these areas. Kind of opposite, as we mentioned before, in Colorado and western Kansas, this region has been dry for the last year, and they have been getting some precipitation in the last week, but it's been enough to kind of keep things where they're at and not see conditions degrade much more. So they are still abnormally dry in Colorado, western Kansas, and there are concerns with that moving forward, specifically with irrigating winter wheat crops. There's been pivots running in eastern Colorado, and then some cattle producers having to haul water. So there's not enough water in some of these locations for cattle, per se, to get their what they would typically get off the landscape. People have had to move water into those regions. And then also kind of moving back into the wetter portions of the region, currently wet soils still have the potential to slow planting progress as that gears up, even if we see close to average precipitation amounts. So if we see less than normal precipitation moving forward in this region, planting may progress at a faster rate than what we have seen in the past year and what we were thinking might happen. But if we see even normal amounts of precipitation across much of the Corn Belt and Northern Plains, that would slow planting significantly. If you see that map there on the screen, what that is a spring leaf index anomaly. And what this allows us to do, this is a product from the National Phenology Network with the USGS and the University of Arizona. And it lets us show where spring is literally sprung. So where we're seeing leaf out on plants across the region, and if it's above earlier than normal or a bit later than normal. What you see there is across much of the Southeast, leaf out occurred up to 20 days early in some of those locations. So we moved north, it slowed down a bit, but we are seeing earlier than normal leaf outs across southern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, parts of Missouri, and actually as you move into Kansas there, across the southern tier of the state, that's actually a little bit behind normal. They are seeing leaf out now, things are greening up, but it was a little bit behind where the long-term mean has been. And just to kind of wrap it up, since winter is climatologically over at the end of February, one thing we'll start looking at is when are we going to see our last hard freeze? Some locations in the southern, what this map is showing is the historical climatological median date of the last hard freeze. So this has not necessarily happened yet, but across the southern tier in parts of Missouri, Kentucky, southern Illinois, southern Indiana, we're coming up on that climatological median last freeze date. So some of those areas that might be coming up, moving into as you move north and west from there, that timeline starts going back as you'd expect as one moves north and west, where we typically see cooler springs. Whereas in North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, you're still probably 2 months out from that last freeze date at this point, or just shy of 2 months out. So that's just to put in a little perspective climatologically when we see our last hard freeze, and growers are excited to get out and plant, and after these dates that starts to become a more realistic possibility based on the climatology. Just to delve in briefly to state impacts that we got sent from our partners across the region, some more specific impacts rather than these broad ones we've been trying to summarize. In Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky, despite some recent drier weather, a lot of standing water has been observed by our partners there, standing in fields. From our partners in Nebraska and Minnesota, it's been noted that some areas that had previously seen ponding water in agricultural fields have improved somewhat. Currently, overwinter crops and trees are breaking dormancy from recent warm temperatures in Kansas, Indiana, Nebraska, Ohio, and Missouri. We had reports from there. One significant concern in the Western Corn Belt and the Plains states is due to the wet soil moisture, or wet soils generally, it takes longer for those soils to heat up, and that causes green up of grass to also be slower. Given the last couple of years, there's a lot of residual fuel on the landscape in these locations, and if we do see dry, windy days, that would increase your fire risk in those regions. So that's one thing they're watching. There have been reports of some fires already occurring in Nebraska and Kansas, and we've gotten some pictures sent to us from our partners about those. On a more positive note, with the milder conditions we've experienced recently and somewhat drier conditions, field operations are starting to ramp up in several states, and wet soils are still impacting the start and progress of this in some regions, some parts of the region, others. With the milder temperatures, we've also seen frost out in many locations as the season advances, so soils aren't frozen in parts of Nebraska, Minnesota, and Michigan we had reports of. But because of the snow we saw in February in parts of Wyoming, there were increased transportation issues there along the I-80 corridor. One interesting one interesting article that was sent to us by our partner in Minnesota was that farmers that are trying to get corn off the field before the ground thaws in some more northern parts of the state are actually encountering hibernating bears as a harvest risk. So bears have been hibernating between the rows and in the residue in the fields, and they've had some encounters there with farming equipment. High lake levels and shoreline flooding erosion continues in the Great Lakes. So that's really an ongoing story. A positive note that was noted out of Nebraska is that the milder conditions currently experienced there have led to good calving weather, as calves and lambing are going on right now. And contrast to last year where they had that big bomb cyclone move through and flooding as a result, this year's calving season is off to a good start. Also, as noted before, drier conditions in Colorado and western Kansas has required water hauling for cattle and irrigation of winter wheat crops as we've moved into it. And with that, Jeff is going to take over here and do the outlooks. So thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you, BJ. Yep, Jeff, I see your screen. By the way, if you did get into this webinar and you can actually hear my voice, you're one of the lucky ones. We do have quite a few people on, but apparently there are some connection problems, and you can guess why that might be. So, Jeff, can I hear you?
All right. How's my
yes,
sound? Very good.
Sounds good. You have 3 minutes. No, I'm just kidding.
We'll try.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks, BJ. Well, we forgot to mention earlier, happy vernal equinox to everyone. I believe it's 10:58 this evening, Central Time. The sun passes over the equator, and hopefully we'll be bringing warmer temperatures, and we're going to see a little bit here in just the short term. I'd like to start with some real-time weather. There's quite a bit to talk about here before we look into the extended time frame, but currently an active weather pattern across much of the central part of the U.S. The surface map, the weather map here on the right side, my cursor, you can see a strengthening area of low pressure. It's actually an elongated area of low pressure from Kansas on up into the Great Lakes region. But that doesn't do it justice, because we are basically, this is a dividing line between some very warm subtropical air with both subtropical Pacific and Gulf of Mexico origin to the south and east, with some air from northern North America, the high latitudes in Canada. And this is the weather map here is actually as of 7 p.m. Central here this evening. But we have a very, very, well, because of this contrast in air masses plus an active jet stream, we've got a very interesting 24 to 36 hour time frame. On the left here, you can see the current, well, this was actually this morning, the current hazards map from the National Weather Service, and there's a lot of color on there. And if you're a weather geek, that certainly gets one's attention. But depending on where you are relative to this weather system, a wide variety of weather conditions and we'd have to say extremes. Those range from flash flood concerns, also probably some severe weather concerns, or at least the possibility for severe weather as the day goes on here to the south, and you can see that in the dark green and dark red. BJ already talked about this, but the sort of the dark pink color here, central Kansas, that's a red flag warning for the combination of high winds, low humidities, and high fire danger. And then as we move north and west, things change very, very rapidly. There's actually a 40 degree or greater Fahrenheit temperature difference here across this frontal boundary. Another thing to note about this high pressure system, if you're a weather geek, this is a 1040 millibar high. And if you do the climatology and you look at this, this is a very, very unusual, very high pressure for any time of the year. And it's actually, the models have it progged to even strengthen a bit here over the next day or two. The practical result of that, though, you can see all of the isobars here between that high pressure and then the low pressure across central portions of the region. And because of that, we've got very, very strong winds developing. And as a result, we have, well, a lot of winter weather advisories, including here in red, blizzard warnings for much of the high plains up to the Front Range. And then those transition off to winter storm warnings and winter weather advisories through large portions of the Midwest. But a very, very, well, certainly a very, very winter-like day from portions of the northern plains. And BJ mentioned Interstate 80 and the problems they've had this year. This likely, given a north wind across an east-west highway in that part, they'll probably be adding to their statistics yet one more time here with the storm before all is said and done. But looking at this map here, it is fairly typical of what is expected here over the next week or two. I'm going to look next at the forecast precipitation totals for the upcoming week through Thursday morning of next week. And you can see for large portions, central and eastern and southern portions of the central region, 1 inch to 2 inch rainfall totals, or precipitation totals, I should say. Some of this will be frozen back here again into the western parts of the region, but especially here over the central Corn Belt down into the Ohio Valley, we're looking at another very, very significant precip event, and including some areas which have, as BJ noted, been a little bit drier. So that's a major factor. This will certainly bring soils back up to near saturation, if not above saturation, with more runoff because of the unusually wet conditions here. And some of the wettest areas we've seen here recently down in the Ohio Valley, unfortunately, that's where some of the heaviest precipitation is forecast. Note, though, that there is a very strong northwest to southeast gradient, and that as you do move to the northwest, precipitation totals are expected to be much lighter. Almost all of this, or a good chunk of this precipitation, is associated with the current system over the next 48 hours. There will be another chance for precipitation, though, towards the middle of next week. That would be the next one. Some of that is included here. Looking on into the medium range forecast guidance, we still have an active west to southwest flow pattern and a subtropical jet stream across central and southern portions of the U.S. And then we do have, there's a northern branch of the jet stream with occasional incursions of Canadian origin air, like what we're seeing occurring right now. But both the 6 to 10 day and 8 to 14 day outlooks here, the most recent versions, and these have been consistent over the last few days, are suggesting colder than normal conditions out here in the western U.S., closer to that trough, with warmer than normal or milder than normal temperatures across much of the central and eastern U.S. as a result of this, again, broad ridging feature. For precipitation here on the right-hand side, you can see for central and eastern parts of the region that above normal precipitation totals are favored. The same is true for far out west. And then we have the near normal here for western portions of the region. But the 6 to 10 day and 8 to 14 day timeframes are almost identical, very, very similar patterns. And what it does suggest, once again, is a fairly active storm track here from southwest to northeast through the Midwest. So there will be probably multiple chances for precipitation. And again, given the problems that we've had for most of the off season back into last fall, this certainly would suggest additional problems, especially for the areas where the growing season has begun across the southern part of the region. Moving further ahead, we have a new set of long lead outlooks. I'm going to start here with the month of April. There's some similarities here from what we just saw in the medium range forecast guidance. But for the month of April, you can see the Climate Prediction Center is calling for an increased risk or likelihood of above normal temperatures, essentially for the eastern half of the region, the equal chance for much of the west, and even a little bit here of favored below normal temperatures way up in portions of the high plains and into the northern Great Plains. But for the majority of a region, again, milder than normal temperatures, at least the statistics push that way. Precipitation a little bit more complicated with elevated risk of above normal precip in the central parts and portions of the region, with equal chances elsewhere. But again, somewhat similar to the same pattern that we saw with the medium range forecast guidance. Looking ahead now into the 3-month April through June outlook, important to note here in terms of the tools and what go into this outlook, the ENSO factor here, the tropical forcing at this point in time is relatively weak. We currently have neutral conditions in the Pacific. Those are expected to continue for the spring and into the summer. So most of the outlook, or much of the outlook that you see here, is based very heavily on numerical weather guidance output as well as long-term trends. And what they basically say, these are very consistent too with previous issuances in the last couple months, but collectively for almost all of the region except for the far northwestern portion where we have equal chances. Mean temperatures are pushed into the are a greater risk of above normal or warmer than normal mean temperatures here, and also for, again, almost all but far western portions of the region, we also have an elevated risk of above normal precipitation. So that warmer and wetter direction. It's worth noting here, because we especially I'm going to show here the summer outlook, that empirically warmer and wetter is less frequent. It's actually a lot less frequent. We typically see warmer than normal mean temperatures associated with drier than normal conditions, and vice versa. But for this one, the outlooks have been consistent, pushing in that warmer and wetter direction. And here is the outlook for our summer months, June through August here of this year. Very similar, but you can see a little bit larger area across the upper Midwest where equal chances for mean temperatures are suggested, but then increased likelihood for the southern and eastern part of the region from above normal temperatures. Precipitation totals here on the right. Most of the region, or much of the region, is in the equal chances category, but for the central and eastern Corn Belt, central and eastern portions of the region, we do have an elevated risk also of above normal precipitation, similar to the other outlooks. Looking specifically at some hydrological impacts, I'm going to look at the major basins here. These are from the river forecast centers from the National Weather Service, but for the upper Mississippi Basin, because of the wet landscapes and because of the heavier precipitation that's been with us for much of the last several months up to the recent past, there is an elevated risk for flooding over many parts of the basin. Here in the Mississippi, you can see a lot of that in the upper down into the middle stretches of the Mississippi Basin, especially here for portions of eastern Iowa, northwestern Illinois, along the Mississippi, either moderate or major flooding or likelihood, or certainly the potential for that is elevated this year versus what it would typically be. One other area of note here where a little bit higher elevated risk is the Red River of the North, moving up to the northwest, and you can see the area outlined here in purple where there are significant chances of either major or moderate flooding indicated. And again, a lot of that has to do with well, several things, but mostly the wet soils, the wet landscapes, plus heavy snowfall over the winter. A lot of that is melted, as BJ noted, but there still is some there. And so one of the conditional factors here as we look at these that's going to be very important in the next several weeks will be the timing of the snow melt. So far, it's been relatively orderly this year, but where it goes in the future, and if we do have a sustained snow melt or flashy snow melt, that will matter. But just as importantly will be the precipitation patterns here over the next several weeks, and that could change this outlook if we were to see heavy rain or vice versa. Looking at the Missouri Basin here, moving off to the west, there are a couple of areas noted by the river forecast centers. The highest risk here, or greatest threat here, just to the west of where we talked about in the Red River Valley, you can see the James Basin here with a 50 to 70% greater than normal risk of at least moderate flooding. Also elevated risks for flooding up here in the far upper reaches of the Missouri Basin, as well as down along the middle and lower part of the Missouri Basin, but not quite as high statistically or numerically as what we see up here in the northern plains. Finally, moving south and east down to the Ohio River Basin, we included the Cumberland Basin here. These orange squares indicate areas with at least 50% chance of minor flooding or worse. And what you can see generally and geographically is that the highest risk for flooding issues would be across lower sections of the Ohio, and then it looks like into the Wabash Valley here to the north, and less as you go east and north from there. So definitely because of all the heavy precipitation and the wet landscapes, we do have an elevated risk in many areas, as BJ noted. And then switching gears here northwards up into the Great Lakes area, as BJ noted, many of the lakes are either at or very close to record levels currently. They are beginning, all the lakes are beginning their seasonal increase. They typically peak here during the summer months. As you can see, for the 4 of the lakes here outlined, forecast conditions here in each of these maps are are given the actual forecast is the dash line here is the most probable. These are produced operationally by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but you can also see here that they have given basically a prediction envelope with the most probable outcome here in the sort of the orange color, and the historical possibilities here in gray. They've also added 3 wet years or high water level years here in the past, including last year, 2019, as well as 1996 in blue and 2017 in purple. But the bottom line here is for the Great Lakes, and this is a high likelihood that this, especially given the outlooks, but more importantly, given where the lakes are right now, they will almost certainly remain at or even above record levels. That's especially true for the Lake Michigan Huron Basin and also for Lake Erie. So new records likely will be set here over the next several months as all of the lakes approach their seasonal maximum. So summarizing here, we've seen a little bit of a respite in some of the region, although we have had an awful lot of precipitation long term. A little bit of drier weather over the last several weeks has helped. It's even been a little bit too dry over far western, southwestern portions of the region, western Kansas and in the plains of Colorado. The warmer than normal temperatures have brought some of our overwintering crops out of dormancy a little bit early across the far southern part of the region. But looking ahead then, the short and medium range forecast guidance suggests an active weather pattern across large portions of the region, especially central and south, with warmer and probably wetter than normal type of weather conditions. And for many of the problems and impacts that we've talked about, that would not be helpful. The long lead outlooks, the brand new ensemble we have here, is consistent with the last couple of issuances. It also suggests increased probabilities of warmer and wetter than normal conditions, both for the spring and at least for central and eastern portions of the region for the summer season beyond that. So fairly continuous type of pattern in terms of the forecast. Hydrologically, because of the wet soils and the possibility of additional, at least normal, if not above normal rain precipitation totals, flooding risks are elevated across several portions of the region, especially across the Red River Valley of the North and the mid and upper reaches of the Mississippi River valleys. And as we just seen here, the Great Lakes are definitely expected to continue causing problems. One thing I did not mention, which is very important here relative to the Great Lakes, and it has to do with the record levels, is that the wind direction and strength plays a major role in impacts on the shorelines. And any time we do see sustained high winds, and that will be the case here over the next 24 to 36 hours, unfortunately, we will see flooding on the shoreline, not just flooding, but also problems with erosion. So wind events will play a major role in looking at impacts as we move forward. For further information,
Jeff, hey Jeff,
yes.
Let's cut to the next screen. We're going to go to the, yeah, there you go.
There we go.
We're going to end this here sort of abruptly because we're running out of time and we have some questions we got to get to.
Okay.
So I want people to see this. You can talk about it because you're on the menu for this one.
All righty. Well, it's forecasting here for an upcoming webinar for the month of April. You're going to get both the Central Region webinars usually from Pete in Minnesota, but you get a double deal or a double 2-for-1. There's also a webinar here concerning the Great Lakes lake levels, high level, and looking both at where we've been and where they're headed here over the next several months. That's on Monday, the 13th of April. You can see in the late morning, and the registration information is down below. This is another NOAA-sponsored event, and if it's something of interest, please go ahead and sign up, and we'll talk more, have updates on some of what you've just seen. And I think with that, we'll finish up.
Yeah, actually go back and leave that screen up, would you?
Will do. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to get to the questions real quick. We had some questions about some of the technical language that we used. First of all, what is frost out? Frost out is simply when we're talking about out of the soil. So when frost leaves the soil, which is usually mid to late, It can be any time actually, but January, February is when December is when it sets in, depending on where you are. And so we still have some frozen soils way up north. Frost out just means when you're losing this frost or frozen soils. Jeff mentioned a 1040 high, 1040 millibars, which is we could just say a big high pressure system, maybe unusually high, strong system moving into the northern plains. It's going to yeah, it's unusual, and it usually means a lot of wind, especially when there's a low pressure system going across the southern part, which Jeff also talked about. So a lot of wind. That's why we have blizzard warnings out in western Nebraska and Wyoming and other parts of the plains. I would say it's pretty normal to have spring storms like that, where you have 70 degrees in southeast Nebraska and 20 degrees in northwest Nebraska. That is common across a state or across the middle part of the Great Plains, especially this time of year. Moving on. So, Dennis, you said you were on. I got your email, but I haven't heard you yet. Have you unmuted?
I've unmuted. Can you hear me?
Oh, wow, it did work. I did. Okay, here's Dennis to save the day. So Dennis from the USDA is going to help us answer some of the questions that we're going to go through here. We have a few, so I got to some of them right away. But so I'm going to, Dennis, since I have you, and Jeff, first of all, Jeff and BJ, thank you very, very much for your presentations. And we're going to keep going. We'll get through all these questions one way or the other. If you have to leave, I understand that. Other folks that are on the line. First question is, will producers in the northern plains be able to plant corn or soybeans if the soil moisture is above a certain threshold? And do we have any idea what that threshold would be?
No, we don't know what that threshold is. Will there be areas that don't get corn and soybeans planted this year? Probably there will be. There was last year. It's likely there will be again this year. The couple things that are limitations are, one is soil moisture and your ability to get in the field and get it planted. Two is, has the soil reached an appropriate temperature? Used to be problems with planting seeds in wet, cool soils was a problem. Seed treatments have limited that issue. So there's that problem. There are also problems with prevent plants this year and planting into June. I think Doug was going to ask about that. There may be some places that go that late this year. I think people's experiences last year may have warded them off a little bit, and they may be willing to accept prevent plants, which means they will accept crop insurance. They have a crop insurance payment for not planting because it's too wet. Overall, we're not as bad as we were last year at this point. So I think we're still going to be able to have windows and get things in the ground. We're just cautioning people that there are still plenty of wet soil issues and precipitation chances. Unlike last year, we have some warmth coming, it looks like, compared to what we did last year.
Yeah,
it's also important to note that there's a lot of dependence on the soil types and texture, and that we do the coarser textured soils drain more quickly, and although many of our most productive soils are not and drain more slowly, so there will be differences, but some of it will depend on where you are on the location.
Thank you. Will producers be able to plant corn or soybeans in the northern plains right after unharvested 2019 corn and soybeans are harvested? If not, how long will they have to wait before they can plant?
Well, if the soil is appropriate, they can plant another crop right afterwards, but you have to go in. There's probably different fertilizing schemes they need to do. But just because there's one crop there, it doesn't mean you can't plant another crop immediately afterwards. That's not the limitation. It's the condition of the soil that is the biggest issue.
Yeah.
And as you've seen, one last thing on the two, there have been people desperate to get field work done, and as a result have driven on fields that should ideally not be driven on, and we have issues with compaction, and there are other complications because of the long-term wetness that we've seen in many of these areas.
Yeah. Jeff or BJ, this is really for you guys. Regarding the lack of Great Lakes, well, he says snow cover Not sure if that means snow cover or ice. But anyway, regarding the lack of Great Lakes snow cover, when will lake effect snow stop being a factor? Will the lake levels be a concern for agriculture? So I think let's go back and rephrase that. Great Lakes ice cover.
Right.
When will lake effect snow stop?
I can start. Theoretically, it won't stop as long as there is cold air, and it usually has to come from high latitudes to create the temperature difference across the lake. So theoretically, it would not stop, but we will see gradually with the change in seasons, we'll see a reduction in the frequency and severity of cold air outbreaks. So typically and this year we've seen lake effect snow very late because the lakes have been, as BJ mentioned, have been so open and relatively warm. So lake effect snow really is not, one would expect not to see much of an influence at all at this time of the year, or this time of season. In terms of agriculture, though, it's an interesting question. The lakes are warm, they're open still, and many times, not always, but there is an empirical observation that the open lakes allow, especially areas downstream, and Michigan would be one of those, many parts of Michigan, to warm the air temperatures downstream to warm a bit more quickly than they would otherwise, because a lot of energy is consumed in melting ice and evaporation of water as well. But many seasons, some of the coldest and latest springs that we have typically are associated with high ice coverage on the lakes. Not always, but so I would say initially maybe a bit of an earlier warm up would not be would certainly be possible given where the lakes are right now and the low ice coverage.
And very quickly, I think, Dennis, can you comment on the prospect for corn and soybeans planting extending into June again this year? I mean, I guess that's a guess on your part.
Well, I tried to address that a little bit earlier.
Right.
One, that's still a long way to go from now. Two, I think people planted a lot later last year for various reasons. And I think their experiences might ward them off from doing that again this year. And they might just prevent plant, or if they can convert to something else, do that. I don't think we'll see as late a planting because there were various reasons people went well into June last year.
Are there concerns for dryness in the southeast? I think that means southeast U.S. And we didn't really cover that per se. I think they've got a lot of water down there over the winter.
Except for the Gulf and portions of Florida, they are actually dry now. But you're right. Most of the southeast is abnormally wet. The storm track has gone through there repeatedly. But the far southeast Florida, there are concerns right now about dryness.
So I wouldn't say it's any more concerning than normal, except for maybe some places that are already dry, like you said, Florida. Any comments on the intensity of storms these days? Are we seeing stronger storms, more intense storms as a rule compared to 40 or 50 years ago?
It's
BJ's. Yep.
It's BJ's thesis, and so make sure he gets a chance.
Okay.
Go, Jeff, you want me to take that?
Sure.
There is some empirical evidence. What we've seen in the precipitation records across a lot of the Midwest is that the top end events, so where we are seeing heavy rainfalls, really intense events, there are statistically significant increases in those across much of the central U.S. and much of the region. Where we haven't seen as much of an increase is what you call the average rainfall event. But I mean, really the 30-second take-home answer is the stronger storms that we are seeing are generally getting more intense across the region, and there's just more frequent wet days. And that's all compounding to what we've seen in the last several years, where we are getting more water on the landscape as a result.
Okay. Well, Dennis, we're being asked that can you expand on the issues with late planting this year? Is there anything else you want to say about that? Maybe geographically, obviously South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, Michigan.
Yeah, the northern areas are wettest, especially the plains areas are wettest, and Those are going to be the biggest ones because they are slower to dry and slower to warm up compared to some of the other ones. If you look at soil moisture plots, Eastern Corn Belt looks like maybe they're not as bad. Reports are they are, you know, relatively wet over there too, and we're getting more rainfall at this point. The situation compared to last year is that we do look like we're going to be wet again, but we, you know, the outlooks do lean warm, like Jeff was talking about, kind of an odd combination. So warmer temperatures would theoretically help us dry some more and give us some windows for opportunity for planting. And we do have places, and when I've been out talking with people who said they think their soils are in better shape than they were last year at this point. So there will be some opportunities here. What's it going to end up like? It really depends on how much more rainfall we get, how frequent that rainfall is, and how much drying we can get in and around that for getting people in to plant. We'll leave it there.
I have a question for the core, and I'm let's see if we have any core. Nope, I don't see my usual people I pick on here. So anyway, the question really was, do I have a projection for the main stem Missouri River reservoirs? And I don't have that, but I do believe the Corps has such a thing on their website. It's a four-panel graphic that you can go and look at the water. You have to go to the water management part of Corps of Engineers for the Missouri River, and they should have what their projections are. I know that they're well, actually, here's what I do know. Now that I'm thinking more about this, they're projecting another top 10 runoff year. I can say that. That's a projection for the upper Missouri. So that'd be the total amount of runoff they're measuring more or less at below Gavin's Point or at Sioux City. I can't remember which one that is. But anyway, for the upper part of the basin. So flows will be definitely above normal. Like I think someone said earlier, double the amount of runoff in February, and for the most part, double the amount of releases, at least in February, and I don't remember in March. I think through lately until the rains came, certainly increased flows out of Gavin's Point compared to normal. So that's what I do remember reading from the Corps. That's it for questions. Anybody else have any other comments in the group here? Okay. Well, you'll be able to hear Jeff again, like you said, on April 13th. We will be back with you on the 16th of April for another roundup of things and the shape of things to come and all that business. So thank you very much. Stay well, and talk to you all later. Thanks for all the presenters.